The sky over the Pacific Ocean in 1942 was a deadly theater. Thousands of feet above the waves, Japanese and Allied pilots engaged in lightning-fast duels that often lasted only seconds. Every maneuver, every pull of the trigger could mean life or death. Fighter planes screamed past each other, machine guns rattled, and explosions left trails of smoke against the endless blue. For these pilots, the sky was not a place of freedom or adventure. It was a battlefield where hesitation could be fatal. Japanese pilots were trained from the moment they could hold a model airplane in their hands to become ruthless and precise. They studied tactics, memorized enemy formations, and drilled endlessly in simulators and training fields. Courage was measured in kills, and mercy was seen as a weakness that could cost the lives of comrades. Yet, even in the midst of such rigorous preparation, the chaos of war introduced something that no training could prepare them for: the human face of the enemy. On a clear morning over a remote Pacific island, a squadron of Japanese fighters spotted enemy aircraft approaching. The tension in the cockpit was palpable. Every pilot knew what was expected. Their mission was clear: intercept, destroy, and return without hesitation. As engines roared and the first tracers lit up the sky, the pilots engaged in the deadly dance they had been taught their entire lives. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity as planes twisted, dove, and weaved in an aerial chess game where one wrong move meant falling into the sea, sometimes never to be seen again. Amid this chaos, one pilot's eyes caught movement that did not fit the usual pattern of combat. Men were tumbling from their burning aircraft, parachutes deploying, or failing to deploy, in a silent descent toward the ocean below. For a trained warrior, the instinct was simple: target and eliminate the threat before it could regroup. Every cell in the pilot's body screamed to follow orders. And yet, in those fleeting moments, something unexpected stirred, a thought that transcended rank, duty, and fear. These were human beings, like him, caught in a battle not of their choosing. History is filled with tales of aerial aces and legendary dogfights, but rarely do we hear of hesitation in the heat of combat. This hesitation was not cowardice, it was the spark of a moral choice, a flicker of compassion that would soon define a story lost to the chaos of war. As the pilot watched the enemy fall through the sky, a silent decision began to form. He could continue as trained, firing without remorse, or he could do the unthinkable: spare lives that were already teetering on the edge of death. The Pacific War was a conflict of unimaginable scale, where orders and survival often left little room for conscience. But even here, in the unrelenting roar of engines and gunfire, the extraordinary could emerge. That moment, that choice would set this pilot apart, not as a hero of destruction, but as a man whose humanity refused to be silenced. It was a single decision that would echo far beyond the sky, leaving questions about honor, duty, and morality that remain unanswered to this day. In the distance, the ocean stretched endlessly, calm and indifferent to the chaos above. Yet the skies told a story of life, death, and the fleeting chance of mercy. For one Japanese pilot, the battlefield was no longer just a place of orders and strategy. It had become a crucible where the essence of being human was tested in its most extreme form. And in that testing, a choice was made, one that would haunt him, challenge history, and remind the world that even amid the most brutal conflict, compassion could still find a way. That small, silent act would ripple across time, proving that even in war, one person could defy expectation and honor the fragile spark of life.
The life of a Japanese fighter pilot in the Pacific War was defined by discipline, precision, and an unwavering sense of duty. From the moment they joined the military, these men were trained to see the enemy as nothing more than targets, numbers in a formation, threats to eliminate with speed and efficiency. Every lesson, every flight drill, Every simulation was designed to strip away hesitation, to make the instinct to kill automatic. They memorized aircraft silhouettes, calculated angles of attack, and drilled endlessly in evasive maneuvers, all while internalizing the unspoken rule: mercy has no place in the sky. Yet even the most disciplined pilot could not predict the moments when the harsh lines between duty and conscience blur. Our pilot had followed orders faithfully for months, flying missions over vast stretches of ocean, engaging in dogfights that left only wreckage behind. He had seen planes spiral into the sea, witnessed men swallowed by fire, and felt the adrenaline-fueled thrill of narrowly surviving encounters that could have ended his life in an instant. Every day, the war demanded more kills, more precision, more obedience. There was no room for doubt, and yet doubt began to creep in, quietly in the back of his mind. The turning point came not during a massive battle, but in a moment of quiet observation in the sky. He noticed how young some of the enemy pilots were, their faces etched with fear beneath their helmets, their hands gripping controls with desperation. They were trained like he was, following orders, doing what they were told, and yet they were human, fragile, fallible, just like him. In the midst of strategy and dogfighting tactics, the sight struck him in a way that no textbook ever could. These were not just targets, they were living men with families, hopes, and lives that mattered beyond the battlefield. Military culture in Imperial Japan left little room for empathy. Honor was measured in victories, loyalty to the empire, and the willingness to sacrifice oneself without hesitation. A pilot who faltered, who allowed compassion to interfere with duty, risked more than his career. He risked being labeled weak, even dishonorable. And yet, the human heart is not so easily trained. Beneath the strict layers of indoctrination, a moral awareness persisted, waiting for the right moment to surface. For him, that moment was approaching, and it would test everything he had been taught about duty, obedience, and honor. As he prepared for another engagement, the thought of what lay ahead filled his mind. He had been taught to strike first, to strike hard, and never second-guess his actions. Yet the reality of the war, the smoke, the fire, the human faces falling from the sky, created a tension between instinct and conscience. Could he continue to follow orders blindly, or would he find the courage to act differently, to acknowledge the humanity of his enemies even in the heat of battle? The question was terrifying, but the answer would define him forever. For the Japanese pilot, duty was no longer a simple matter of following orders. It had become a struggle between loyalty to his superiors and loyalty to something deeper, the innate understanding of right and wrong. In the cockpit, with the engine screaming and the wind whipping past, he realized that true courage was not only about fighting, it was about choosing how to fight. And sometimes the bravest act was not to destroy, but to preserve. The stage was set for a decision that would challenge the very principles he had lived by. It was a quiet tension, invisible to the chaos around him, but it weighed heavily on his mind and heart. In that silent crucible, the pilot began to see that war, with all its rules and orders, could never fully extinguish the spark of humanity. Even trained soldiers, even the fiercest fighters, could make a choice that defied expectation, honor, and tradition. And in making that choice, they could leave a mark on history far more enduring than any tally of kills.
The moment came suddenly, like a flash of lightning splitting the sky. Engines roared, tracer rounds streaked past, and the familiar chaos of aerial combat surrounded him. The Japanese pilot had already engaged the enemy, weaving and diving, every movement instinctive after months of training. In the heat of battle, there was no time to think, only to act. Planes collided with the sky itself, leaving trails of smoke and fire in their wake. Yet amid this frenzy, something extraordinary happened. He saw them falling, enemy pilots plummeting through the sky, their parachutes either failing or barely opening.
In that instant, the battlefield shifted from a place of duty to a moral crucible. Ordinarily, these men would have been considered eliminated threats, targets to be finished if necessary. The rules of survival and military logic demanded it. But as he watched, a strange clarity emerged. These were not faceless enemies anymore. They were human beings, desperately grasping at life, no different in fear and fragility than himself. Time slowed for a heartbeat. The roar of engines faded into the background as the pilot confronted a question that no training had prepared him for. Should he continue to follow the rules of war, or should he act on a deeper, more human instinct? Every fiber of his being resisted the impulse. He had been taught that mercy was weakness, that hesitation could cost his comrades their lives, that the honor of a soldier demanded ruthlessness. And yet, something in his chest tightened with a force stronger than fear or duty. He could see the terror in the enemy pilots' eyes, the way their bodies twisted as they fell, and he felt an unbearable pull to intervene. It was a decision that seemed impossible in the moment, yet it rose unbidden, insisting on being made. He maneuvered his aircraft carefully, approaching one of the men tumbling helplessly toward the ocean. There was no time for heroics, no expectation of glory, only a fleeting chance to save a life. He flew close enough to provide cover, signaling and guiding as best he could without endangering himself. With precise timing and nerves of steel, he created conditions that increased the odds of survival for those he had just fought against. Each second was a tightrope, and the smallest miscalculation could prove fatal. It was a quiet rebellion against the war itself, a refusal to let training erase the humanity that had always existed beneath it. The act was perilous. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and he could have crashed, been shot down, or drawn the ire of his superiors. But he pressed on, driven by something neither rank nor fear could suppress. Each life he spared felt both astonishing and terrifying. In that moment, he understood the power and weight of choice. War had demanded destruction, but here, in these few miraculous seconds, he had chosen creation, the preservation of life against all logic. He also realized, in a way that would stay with him forever, that even in the midst of chaos, a single human decision could ripple outward, affecting countless others in ways he could not yet imagine. By the time the engagement ended, the Japanese pilot had performed an act almost unthinkable in the military code of his time. Lives that were meant to end had been extended, perhaps by mere minutes, perhaps by fate itself. As he pulled away, adrenaline still coursing through him, he felt a strange emptiness mingled with awe. He had defied orders, defied expectation, and yet he had done what no training had ever told him was possible. He had chosen mercy. That single decision would echo in his mind for the rest of his life. The Pacific skies had witnessed not just a battle, but an extraordinary moment where compassion triumphed over duty. The consequences of this choice were yet to come, repercussions that could threaten his career, challenge his loyalty, and haunt his dreams. And yet, for that brief, shining moment, the pilot had reminded himself and the world that even in war, the human heart could choose to act with courage, not just with firepower. It was a choice that would define him, silently, long after the skies had cleared and the echoes of battle had faded.
The battle was over, but the war inside his mind had just begun. As the engines cooled and the roar of combat faded into distant echoes, the Japanese pilot could not escape the weight of what he had done. Every mission had taught him to follow orders without question. Yet now he faced the consequences of a choice that defied everything he had been trained to believe. Saving the lives of enemy pilots was not just unusual, it was forbidden. It was a breach of the code of conduct, a silent rebellion against the military culture that had shaped him. And yet, despite fear of judgment or punishment, he felt no regret, only a strange, heavy clarity that the act had been right.
Returning to base, he was met with the usual reports of damage, victory tallies, and the cold, bureaucratic language of war. Yet none of it captured what had truly happened in the skies above the Pacific. The pilot replayed every moment in his mind over and over, the faces of the men he had spared etched vividly in memory. Each parachute, each flailing hand, each terrified glance returned to him as if insisting he remember. The adrenaline of combat had faded, replaced by a profound awareness of responsibility. He had chosen mercy, but the act could not be hidden from his conscience. Among his fellow pilots there were whispers of what had occurred. Some admired his skill in the air, unaware of the full story. Others, steeped in tradition and discipline, noticed his hesitation and questioned it. In a culture where obedience was honor and hesitation was weakness, even a single second of mercy could be interpreted as defiance. Yet he could not erase what he had done. The faces of the men he saved haunted him in quiet moments, in empty cockpits, and during solitary flights over the same ocean that had witnessed their survival. Sleep became uneasy. Memories of the plummeting pilots mingled with nightmares of failure and reprimand. He wondered how history would judge him if the truth ever came to light. Would he be considered a traitor for defying orders, or would someone recognize the courage it took to act against expectation? The tension between duty and morality settled deep within him, a constant presence that refused to fade. In the midst of war, he had discovered a truth that no manual could teach. Compassion could be an act of bravery, and the human conscience could survive even in the harshest crucible. This internal struggle colored every mission that followed. Flying through the same skies, engaging the same tactics, he saw the enemy differently. No longer were they simply targets or numbers on a formation chart. Each pilot was a human being with fears, hopes, and lives worth preserving. His act of mercy had changed him, and the change was permanent. It was a quiet rebellion, invisible to most, but powerful in its implications. The war continued, brutal and unrelenting, but he carried within him a reminder that humanity was never completely lost. Over time, he began to reflect on the larger meaning of his actions. He questioned the nature of honor, the definition of courage, and the role of conscience in a world designed to suppress it. Saving lives in the midst of destruction was not an easy choice, and it came with a cost: loneliness, isolation, and the burden of knowing that few could understand why he had done it. Yet the weight of that choice was also a source of quiet strength. It reminded him that even in the darkest moments, one could assert agency, one could choose to uphold the values of life and compassion. The pilot's story became a hidden thread in the fabric of history. To most, it would never be known. To him, it became a defining chapter of his life. The psychological scars of war were not only from combat, but from carrying the weight of conscience. He had glimpsed the possibility of mercy in a world ruled by violence and acted upon it. That decision would echo in his thoughts for decades, a reminder that even when surrounded by orders, regulations, and the machinery of war, an individual could still act with courage, guided not by fear or duty alone, but by a deeper, enduring sense of humanity. Every day, every mission afterward, he carried that moment in his heart, a secret testament to the power of conscience against the machinery of war.
Years passed, and the war eventually ended, leaving behind a landscape scarred by destruction and memory. For most, the Pacific skies held only stories of heroism, loss, and the unrelenting toll of conflict. Yet for one Japanese pilot, the memory of that single act of mercy never faded. The men he had saved had returned to their lives, likely unaware of the role he had played in their survival. Their existence was a quiet proof that even in war, small acts of compassion could ripple outward, shaping the world in ways no soldier could measure. In Japan, the culture of honor and obedience persisted long after the last battles were fought. Veterans returned home carrying medals, wounds, and memories that often went unspoken. For this pilot, however, his most significant act was invisible, a secret that weighed on him more heavily than any formal recognition could. He had defied the rigid hierarchy, chosen humanity over orders, and in doing so, risked everything he had been trained to hold sacred. And yet, there was a strange pride in that defiance, a recognition that true courage was not only about victory in battle, but about the moral choices that defined one's character. Throughout his life, the memory of that day haunted him in quiet moments. He would sometimes recall the faces of the pilots, young men flailing toward the ocean, their fear raw and unfiltered. He wondered what became of them, whether they remembered him at all, and how different their lives had been because of his decision. The memory was at once a source of torment and solace, a reminder that war could take much, but it could not entirely extinguish the human conscience. He had glimpsed the possibility of mercy in a world built on destruction, and he had acted on it. Historians would later study aerial battles, kill counts, and tactical maneuvers, but the quiet moral decisions often went unrecorded. The pilot's story became a hidden thread in the vast tapestry of history, overshadowed by grand strategies and legendary dogfights. Yet its significance endured. It demonstrated that even in the most brutal and dehumanizing circumstances, individuals could exercise judgment, empathy, and courage. One decision made in a matter of seconds had the power to challenge norms, inspire conscience, and alter the course of lives. As decades passed, he carried this lesson with him, long after the uniforms were folded and the planes silenced. He spoke rarely of the event, knowing that few could comprehend the tension between duty and morality, between survival and compassion. Yet in private reflection, he understood that this act had defined him more than any combat victory. It had forged a quiet legacy, not of medals or accolades, but of humanity, a testament that even in war compassion could survive, and even the smallest gestures could resonate through time. The pilot's life became a study in contrasts. Outwardly, he conformed to the expectations of society and tradition, but inwardly he carried a silent rebellion, a constant reminder that the rules of war did not always align with the dictates of the human heart. His act of mercy became a beacon of moral courage, demonstrating that even in extreme circumstances, individuals could choose not only what was expected of them, but what was right. That choice, though hidden, echoed far beyond the Pacific skies, challenging the rigid definitions of honor, duty, and heroism. Ultimately, his story reminds us that history is not only written in battles won or lost, but in the quiet, often invisible choices that define who we are. It challenges us to reconsider the nature of bravery, suggesting that sometimes the most courageous acts are not those that destroy, but those that save. Even decades later, his decision resonates as a testament to the enduring power of conscience. It teaches that humanity can persist in the unlikeliest of places, that mercy can survive amidst chaos, and that one individual, acting in defiance of expectation, can leave an indelible mark on history. The Japanese pilot who spared the lives of his enemies left behind a legacy that transcends time, a story of courage, compassion, and the quiet heroism of the human heart.